In this lecture, I'm going to be discussing the brainstem. So the brainstem is divided really into three regions. First, and I'm going to be working my way up the brainstem. So the more inferior region is called the medulla oblongata. Then we're going to be talking about an area above it, or superior to it, called the pons. And then above it is a third region of the brainstem called the midbrain. So we're going to start with the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is a very busy area in the brain because all the communication that occurs between the brain and the spinal cord has to go through the medulla. So you can think of the medulla oblongata as being the part of the brain that's attached to the spinal cord. So if you find the spinal cord, just above the spinal cord, within the cranial cavity, is the medulla oblongata. So what does the medulla oblongata do? Well, it does a number of things. The primary functions of our medulla oblongata is to keep us breathing and keep our cardiovascular system functioning. So we have what's called vital control centers. So if you're vital, you are required for life, meaning you can't live without these vital control centers of your medulla oblongata. The first one is known as respiratory control centers. So there's a number of small regions within the medulla that regulates our breathing rate. So it, in essence, sets the pace of your breaths. So if you need to breathe faster, it's your medulla oblongata that's going to control muscles so you can breathe faster. If you need to, you can slow your breathing rate, the medulla will do that. So that's pretty vital, breathing. Another control center controls the cardiovascular system. So the cardiovascular control centers include both a cardio or cardiac center, which regulates your heart rate, as well as how forcefully your heart will beat. So your heart beats autonomically. It's got an intrinsic nervous system, meaning it's going to set its own pace, and that's using some electrical current coming from what's called the pacemaker. So your heart will beat without nerves. But if you want to speed it up or slow it down, you need nerves. And these nerves emanate from the medulla oblongata to speed your heart rate, slow it down, as well as increase the force in which your heart will beat. There are other centers called vascular or vasomotor, which control blood vessels, and it helps distribute blood to different parts of the body. So those are two vital centers that are found in your medulla oblongata. There are also some reflexes that are emanating from your medulla oblongata, but by far the most important functions are these first two: respiratory control and cardiovascular control. Above the medulla oblongata is a region called the pons. And the pons, which means bridge, is just that. It links the cerebellum, which is another part of the brain, with these lower parts of the brainstem. So it acts as a relayer. It relays signals between the medulla and upper parts of the brain. That's one of its major functions. Another major function is it assists the medulla in breathing, so it also has some respiratory control centers that will help increase depth of breathing and kind of modulate your breathing. Then an area above the pons is called the midbrain, so area superior to the pons. And this region is divided into a couple different areas. One are the cerebral peduncles. Cerebral peduncles are fibers that connect the upper and lower parts of the brain, again sending information up to higher parts of the brain or bringing information down to lower parts of the brain. There's another region called the corpora quadrigemina. So this sounds real fancy, but that word basically means 4 small mounds, and you're going to see when we look at a picture of the brain why they're called mounds. There are 4 total, so there are 2 superior colliculi and 2 inferior colliculi. So 2 and 2 is 4. So what we're going to look at are the superior mounds, called superior colliculi. What they do is they control reflex movements of your head and eyes in response to a visual stimulus. So a couple key things to look at in this sentence. One is their reflex movements. So it's not when you move your eyes and head consciously towards something. So if you were to look down at your shoes right now, that's not a reflex. What a reflex would be is if you noticed maybe a snake sitting on top of your shoe. That's a visual stimulus that's going to cause a reflex movement. Now more specifically, moving your head and eyes is usually a way to protect your head from whatever that visual stimulus is. So let's imagine that you're at a ball game and a baseball is hit and you don't know it's coming at you, and at the last moment you look up and that baseball is about 2 feet from your head. Well, that's a visual stimulus that needs to cause a reflex movement, so you can move your head out of the way of that incoming baseball. So that's kind of what we mean by reflex movements of the head and eyes in response to a visual stimulus. Something that's going to protect you from danger. So the superior colliculi do that. The inferior colliculi also promote a reflex, but this is more of your head and trunk, almost your whole body, in response to an auditory stimulus. So that's when some noise causes your body to jump, basically. You may have had this occur recently during storms. So a loud thunder is an auditory stimulus, and quite often if that happens in the middle of the night, you're going to jump out of bed. That's a reflex movement of the head and trunk. Again, it's a protective response that our brain has developed over years and years to protect us from possible danger that's making a loud noise. So that's the job of the midbrain. Again, divided into cerebral peduncles and the colliculi. The pons, which is below it, which acts as kind of a bridge, and then the medulla oblongata, which is again attached to the spinal cord. So let's take a look at these 3 regions. So this picture is an actual human brain. It's a mid-sagittal section, medial view. Now this is the most common way to study the brain. We've got models that you're going to see this view. Now our models include the cranial cavity and the bones and other tissue, but this is just the brain. So let's look at our 4 regions. So here we have the brain stem. And the brain stem, if I were to encircle it, is basically this region here. That is your brain stem. Notice it's attached to the spinal cord, so your skull would begin here. And your skull would come around and protect that brain. And you can almost imagine that there would be a nose and a really goofy looking chin. So point being, anything below the magnum foramen would be spinal cord, above would be brainstem. So that's the brainstem. We're going to learn next about this region, the cerebellum. Then we're going to learn about the diencephalon, which is this region, kind of centrally located. And then this big region that you kind of classically think the brain as what it appears with all these folds and crevices, that's the cerebrum. So those are the 4 major regions. We've only talked about the brainstem thus far. So we have medulla, just above the spinal cord, pons, which is kind of this swelling here, just above the medulla, and then the midbrain here. And notice there's 2 arrows pointing to the midbrain. This would be the cerebral peduncles, CP, These are the mounds, the colliculi. There's kind of a mound here and a mound here sticking posteriorly. So always try to use your directional terminology when you're studying the brain. It'll help. For example, the cerebrum is kind of superior. The cerebellum is posterior to the brainstem. The diencephalon is superior to the brainstem. So use your directional terminology. The next video is going to talk about the next major portion of the brain, which is the cerebellum.